Chapter 7. Hubert's eyes locked onto the all-too-familiar, smug face of the Dark Mage, standing mere yards away in the market square. He could practically hear the vermin's sneering lilt, jeering at those around him, with the same sense of delusional superiority that oozed from all of those who slither in the dark. Poisonous waves of dark magic poured from the cluster of mages, clinging to the air like static, and searing Hubert's nerves with ice pellets. Heart thundering in his chest, Hubert's brain scrambled to piece together what intel he had gathered, desperately searching for something that would seem to offer even a fragment of insight as to why Thalus's second-in-command was in the coastal city. Over a week ago, his agents had reported sightings of dark mages that fit the description of Thalus's acolytes, but no evidence of what they were conspiring had been unearthed. Hubert cursed himself for not traveling to Baramas earlier to investigate the matter personally. The last time those who slither in the dark had any notable presence within a populated settlement was during the atrocities in Ramire. The experiments conducted by Solon and the rest of the wretched compatriots had driven the villagers into a violent frenzy that left most of the population dead, torn apart by their own hands, and the buildings burned to cinders. Years later, the village had still not fully recovered from the nightmarish massacre. If something similar were to be inflicted on a city the size of Baramas, the result would be catastrophic. Hubert's eyes darted to the surrounding booths and stacking of crates at the other end of the alley. He needed to get closer, find out what Myson and the rest of the sulking vermin were planning. He gnawed at his bottom lip, fingers digging into the crates he was hiding behind, causing the aged wood to creak under his fingers. It was broad daylight, and the market was wide open. Hubert would be instantly spotted and recognized by Myson. Although he and Lady Edelgard had managed to keep Thalus and the others at arm's length through most of the war, their malignant truce made any attempts of Hubert outright disobeying Thalus's orders or disrupting any of his plans a risk that could easily turn fatal. Like it or not, they were still very much at Thalus's mercy. On several occasions, Edelgard had voiced her desire of looking for opportunities to actively oppose those who slither in the dark, going so far as to suggest they start assassinating some of Thalus's known acolytes, who had wormed their way into key positions across Fodland, with Cornelia in particular being a primary target. As much as Hubert despised every single one festering, malevolent scum, he had cautioned her against such an action. There was no telling what horrors Thalus would rain down upon them in retribution. With the combined forces of the Church and the Kingdom still a mounting threat, they could not afford to split their attention between two hostile forces. Myson and his compatriots continued to converse in low murmurs that barely reached Hubert's ears. A low growl of frustration bubbled in Hubert's chest as he quickly realized there was no path available that would allow him to discreetly inch his way closer to the gaggle of dark mages conspiring in the market square. He could try and make a dash to the next set of crates, though the odds of remaining successfully unseen were almost nil. He thought of waiting until Myson and his cohorts moved on to another location before continuing his pursuit, stalking them like a cat trailing its prey. The idea sat uneasy and curdling in Hubert's stomach. It was quite possible that there were already other agents spread throughout the city, carrying out whatever malicious deeds Myson had planned. Delaying his elimination to the threat standing right in front of him could provide any hidden acolytes the opening they needed to enact their accursed plan. Time was of the essence. Spikes of frost-coated dread lanced through Hubert's core. Hubert was the head of the Imperial Spy Network. He was supposed to be ahead of these types of threats. Yet somehow, a large group of the reviled parasites managed to slip into one of Adrestia's most prominent cities undetected. Had Hubert not been in Baramas for a completely different matter, who knew what type of havoc they might have wreaked? If they had infiltrated Baramas without his knowledge, what else had they wormed their way into? Hubert had spent much of his spare time covertly tracking Thalus's movements. But was there something vital that he had missed? What if they had stolen the skins of other prominent members of Adrestian society without his knowledge? Could their plans already be set in motion, not only in Baramus, but other cities across Adrestia, and Hubert would be none the wiser? "Hubert! Hubert!" A hand on his shoulder, and Sylvain's voice snapped his attention back to the alley. Hubert jumped, blinking and glaring over at his compatriot, who watched him with a confused stare. Hubert had almost forgotten about the Fargus paladin, who had called him aside to the alley to begin with. The man had shown up in Baramus just before. The cold dread turned glacial in Hubert's chest, the air sucked out of his lungs. He cast a wary side glance to the paladin, who continued to watch him with a quizzical look. Who else might they have replaced? Hubert slammed Sylvain against the wall, prompting a startled yelp from the other man. He pressed a dagger to the paladin's throat. "Hey, what are you?" "The crest of Gautier. Show me it!" Hubert snarled loudly, angling the blade so it pressed against Sylvain's neck, ready to pierce the skin with the slightest flick. "What? Have you lost your mind?" Sylvain barked, more angry than alarmed by the knife held dangerously close to the delicate flesh just above his carotid artery. "Your crest, Sylvain! Summon it!" Okay, just ease up on the damn knife and give me a sec." Hubert moved the dagger a hair away so that the blade was no longer pressed directly against Sylvain's neck, but made no move to lower the weapon. He stared at the other man, with eyes narrowed into sharpened slits. Still pinned against the wall, Sylvain lifted his hand. The crest of Gautier flared to life in a blinding cyan glow. His face creased into a furious glare. "Happy?" Sylvain snarled. He swallowed heavily, wary eyes darting down to the dagger still held near his throat. Seeing the Gautier crest eased some of the blades that had been slicing into Hubert's chest. He let out a breath of relief. As far as Hubert knew, although the acolytes could parade around in the stolen flesh of their slain victims without arousing suspicion, they did not possess the capability of replicating any crests that were once held by those they had skinned and assumed the identities of. Unless, of course, those who slither in the dark had learned to mimic a crest's effects and appearance. Hubert leaned into Sylvain once more, the dagger still held firmly at the other man's neck, and earning an angry snarl from the paladin. "The very first lesson you attended during my short tenure as an instructor. What was the first question you asked me?" "Okay, you've definitely lost it." "The question, Sylvain. What was it?" Sylvain took a deep, shuddering breath and answered. "I asked you about the effects of merging spellcaster battalions with magic of your own, if the different types of magic would clash together or stack damage. You also pretended you didn't notice my hand raised for nearly 15 Sothis damned minutes before finally calling upon me. Now, mind telling me what the hell is going on?" Relief swept across Hubert, warm, like the soft rays of a morning sun, before instantly plummeting into his stomach and congealing into shame. Cautious suspicion was not only prudent in Hubert's line of work, but absolutely essential if he wished not only to protect his charges, but to keep himself alive as well. But uncontrolled paranoia could be a deadly toxin, a rot that could easily blind one to rational truth. Hubert had witnessed firsthand how that rot could sink its festering tendrils into one's personal life. As much younger Hubert watched helplessly as his father, fueled by paranoia-induced hostility, lashed out at his mother and younger siblings, keeping the other members of the Vestra family virtual prisoners in their own home, while Hubert had been subjected to increasingly ruthless lessons intended to shape his instincts, but only left him bruised, bleeding, and with ever-growing, boiling hatred for his father. Needless to say, few tears in Hubert's family were shed over the former Marquis's sudden death. Hubert lowered his dagger and stepped away from Sylvain. "My apologies. I needed to be certain," Hubert muttered, eyes downcast, and voice tattered like ripped linen. "Certain about what?" Sylvain snapped. Despite the blade having not cut or even nicked the other man's neck, Sylvain massaged the delicate skin with a light cough rattling his throat. He rearranged his cloak with an irate huff. Hubert grimaced. Still tucked away in the alley's shadows, Hubert's eyes jumped between the dark mages still in the market square and the infuriated knight glaring molten-coated daggers at him. He and Lady Edelgard had done their utmost to shield the rest of their former classmates from the existence of those who slither in the dark. It was bad enough that they had been forced to cooperate with Thalos and the rest of his loathsome acolytes. in order to have a fighting chance against the Church's forces. Even if Hubert and Lady Edelgard had not agreed to their accord, it was highly unlikely that Thalos would just leave them to their own devices, not after the time he and the rest of those who slither in the dark had spent twisting and molding Lady Edelgard into a weapon through their vile experiments. It was years ago, but Hubert still remembered the choking clouds of horror that had surged through him when she had first suggested an alliance with her own torturers. Though, like it or not, they were both already prisoners within Thalos's poisonous snares. At least this path offered them the illusion of freedom, providing them with the modicum of movement they needed to plan and eventually stage their vengeful counterattack. That said, Thalos and the other maggots were becoming far too bold in their heinous acts as of late. Questions of the mysterious dark mages who appeared in wisps of red mist and flanked by monstrous abominations were becoming commonplace amongst the Imperial Army's generals. It would not be long before more of their Garrigmok allies became aware of their presence. Absolute secrecy was no longer a luxury Hubert could afford. He took a deep breath and met Sylvain's hostile gaze. "What I am about to tell you cannot be repeated to anyone else. You are to be made privy to information of the utmost secrecy," Hubert said firmly, fighting to keep his tone neutral. "Revealing what you learn here could put the lives of Her Majesty, as well as many of our generals, in grave danger and jeopardize the war effort as a whole." "Okay, well this better be good, seeing as I'm assuming this information is why you nearly slit my throat just now." Sylvain crossed his arms and hissed. "This is not some trivial drop of gossip that is to be shared like a pitcher of ale," Hubert growled. "No one can know of this, not even Ingrid and Felix. Okay, I get it. Just tell me what's going on." Hubert took another shaking breath and clenched his fists and began to speak. "In the shadows of Fodlan, there lurk a cabal of insidious creatures of dark intent who seek to control or destroy humanity. I do not know what they are called, but I refer to them as those who slither in the dark. For they are like sinister serpents, worming their way through the shadows and striking with poisoned fangs, before disappearing beneath the very earth. They wield magic and technology far beyond the scope of our own, and have infiltrated nearly every level of Fodlan society. There is no organization nor level of governance that is spared from their presence. Although they have remained largely undetected over the centuries, they have left their mark through the atrocities they have committed. Many of the greatest tragedies that have plagued Fodland were orchestrated by their very hands. Even now, they remain just out of sight, waiting for the moment to drown the continent in festering rot." Sylvain silently stared, wide-eyed at Hubert for a solid 5 seconds, before bursting into a roar of laughter that had him red in the face and doubling over. "Hold on! Let me get this straight." Sylvain snickered between wheezing bubbles of laughter. "A cult of spooky worm or snake people are hiding in the shadows and plotting to destroy the world? That's a new one. And what did you call them? Those who slither in the dark?" Wow. Just wow. I have 9-year-old cousins who are better at naming their dolls. Well, you got me. Getting back at old Sylvain, huh? Is this and the knife at the throat payback for the whole Ferdinand having a secret admirer mess? Gotta say, Hubie, you really go all out when pulling a prank. Maybe ease up on the stabby parts next time. Hubert stared at him with a flat look. Sylvain's mirthful grin quickly melted into a pale, wide-eyed shock. "You're being serious." Sylvain gaped at the mage, horror creeping across his face like an early winter frost. "Shit. Shortly before the onset of the war, you may recall the likes of Kronya and Sullen, as well as the heinous crimes they committed." Hubert gritted in a tight voice. "You mean those shape-shifting freaks that steal other people's faces? Like the one who pranced around pretending to be Monica for months before stabbing the professor's father? Wait." Sylvain's face blanched, and his eyes bugged out. "That's who you've been hunting?" "Their ability to assume the appearance and identity of those they slaughter is only one of their abilities within the repertoire of blasphemous skills. But yes, it is Kronya and Solon's ilk that I seek to eradicate." "Hold on. Is that why you freaked out and held a knife at my throat and started interrogating me like I was staging a coup against Edelgard? You thought I had been replaced? Sylvain shouted. He shook his head and took a trembling breath that did little to calm his nerves. Shit, just how bad is this whole mess? Unfortunately, a true scope of their activities is difficult to determine. So much of how they operate is shrouded in darkness, said Hubert, his lips pursed into another grimace. I have been tracking their movements for some time, but have only managed to uncover a sliver of their operations. You are already aware of their nefarious misdeeds in Ramire that devastated the village, as well as their shape-shifting capabilities. Among the rapidly growing list of atrocities they have committed, those who slither in the dark have also performed blood experiments on their captives, often targeting those who bear crests. Furthermore, those who are unfortunate enough to be caught in their grasp are forced into painful and often fatal rituals that bend and break the captives' bodies, reforging them into something monstrous through the eldritch power emanating from pilfered creststones. You mean, like what happened with Miklon? Sylvain mumbled, his brow pinched with grief. Hubert sighed sadly and nodded at the Paladin's dejected expression. Your brother's transformation was caused by misuse of a relic that tried to feed off of crest blood that the wielder did not possess, hence his mutation into the draconic monster. As far as I have been able to ascertain, those who slither in the dark had no hand in that particular tragedy, though the process Thallus and his followers use is not dissimilar. Wait, a while back, when the professor sent the two of us to deal with that bandit camp, one of the bandits had a creststone that turned into a demonic beast. Did that have anything to do with the freaks you're tracking? Sylvain asked, his brow furrowed pensively. I was unable to find any evidence linking their involvement at the bandit camp, but I have no doubt that Thallus had his hands in that debacle as well. Hubert frowned. Given the bandits' proximity to Garreg Mach, it is quite likely they were hired by those who slither in the dark to spy on the monastery. Sylvain let out a ragged breath that shook his whole frame. He slumped forward and rested his forehead against the crates, pulsing shockwaves of distress radiating from the other man's hunched posture. Okay, so blood experiments, mutilating people into demonic beasts, insane amounts of technology and magic we've never heard of, and, oh, you never know for sure entirely who they are because they can wear other people's skin. You realize I'm never going to have a decent night's sleep again after hearing all of this, right? Sylvain groaned with a pained look and a shake of his head. Hubert peered around the side of the crates to monitor his target. To both Hubert's relief and distress, Myson and his compatriots had not left the market square. Fortunately, the tense exchange between Hubert and Sylvain had failed to capture their attention, as the dark mages continued to conspire, seemingly unaware that they were being watched. Beside him, Sylvain rose up on his knees, peeking over the crates, before ducking down beside Hubert once more. So, those creepy guys with the fancy robes over by the vegetable booths? They more of those, slithery creeps? Sylvain swallowed, and nodded in the direction of the market. Of that I have no doubt, Hubert growled, his eyes still locked onto Myson. Great, just great, Sylvain groaned, burying his face in his hands. I thought I could feel a boatload of dark magic energy leaking all over the place, but I thought it was just coming from you. Hubert raised an eyebrow at the observation. You can detect their energy as well? Hubert asked, unable to keep the threads of astonishment out of his voice. Although the ability to detect other spellcasters was far from a rare talent for those who study magic, it was a skill that often took time to develop. Sylvain's innate talent for magic may have been even stronger than Hubert initially thought. Yeah, the one with the stupid hat is really pouring out waves of the stuff, even more than you and Lysithea do. Sylvain gulped. So, you've dealt with these assholes before? How do you want this to go down? Do we get the city guard involved, or try to deal with them ourselves? Hubert gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes at the dark mages. Pulling the city guard into this conflict will only cause more chaos and collateral damage. They are not equipped to deal with the threat those who slither in the dark pose, and will only become a liability. Our primary concern is gathering intel to ascertain what exactly it is they have planned. Once we have that, we can plan our next course of action from there. Okay, so let's sneak back into the market, pretend we're shopping around, and try to listen in on what they're scheming. Easy peasy. Sylvain lit up and gave Hubert a playful jab with his elbow. That should be no problem for the two of us, right? Sylvain's reassuring grin faltered and melted into dismay upon seeing Hubert's face remain scrunched with apprehension. All right, what's the problem now? The one leading that group, Myson, already knows who I am, Hubert muttered. His sharp eyes darted back to Sylvain. I cannot go into the details at this time, but I will say that Myson will recognize who I am the moment I am spotted. If they notice I am meddling in their affairs, the retribution they will inflict upon Her Majesty and the Imperial Army will be absolutely devastating. Myson. Sylvain poked his head up above the crates, eyes narrowing at the cluster of mages. That's the stupid hat guy, right? An absurd depictor, but yes, that is who I speak of. Well, they don't know about me, Sylvain smirked as he crouched down beside Hubert. How about I duck into the market, poke around, and see if I can pick up a few whispered tidbits, then scamper back over here with what I've learned? Hubert pressed his lips into a thin line and furrowed his brow as he mulled over the idea. That could work, though you would be putting yourself at grave risk should the intentions behind your lingering presence at the market be discovered, Hubert said with a stern look at the paladin. Extreme caution must be exercised if you are to proceed with this plan. You cannot allow yourself to be captured. Ah, you almost sound worried about me, Sylvain teased as he pulled Hubert into another one-armed sideways hug. Hubert bristled and shook away the arm looped over his shoulders. This is no jest, Hubert scowled. If I were to be apprehended, I would likely be tortured for every scrap of information I have locked in my mind before being summarily disposed of. If they were to capture you, a crest-bearer, suffice to say that describing the experiments they would inflict upon you as barbaric would be a gross understatement. Hubert shuddered as memories of Edelgard reaching for him with shaking, emaciated arms as she took her first limping steps from the dungeons, ripped at his mind like serrated talons. He shook the memory away and clenched his jaw. Well, that's cryptic and horrible, Sylvain gulped, his face paling once again. Though it looks like we don't have much of a choice. Well, time to get to it. Let me just grab my lance. Sylvain ducked further into the alleyway, where two lances had been placed on the ground. One, the Lance of Ruin, still wrapped tightly in heavy cloth. The other, the Arrow of Indra, Hubert had lent him a while back. Hubert cringed as he watched Sylvain reach for the Arrow of Indra. You should perhaps refrain from bringing that particular weapon with you. Having possession of the Arrow of Indra will immediately mark you as a target of interest. Sylvain turned with a frown and a raised eyebrow. Why would they? Oh, no, Sylvain groaned, pressing a palm to his face and shooting Hubert an exasperated glare. Is that where this thing came from? From them? Oh, now I feel dirty using one of their weapons. You are merely making use of a valuable tool, Hubert said firmly. As far as fetid tools go that are at their disposal, the Arrow of Indra is comparatively benign in both origin and use. It is merely an artifact of a fallen society that has remained within their possession. You should feel no guilt using such a tool. Yeah, still feels weird, though, Sylvain muttered. With a heaving sigh, he reached down to pick up the cloth-wrapped Lance of Ruin instead, and strapped it to his back. Hubert felt a pang of sympathy towards the knight's trepidation. He knew the only reason Sylvain kept the cursed weapon with him at all times was to avoid it being stolen again, and igniting another similar incident to what happened with Miquelon. Well, here it goes, Sylvain said with a forced smile. Hubert watched from the cover of shadows, breath locked up in his chest, as the paladin stepped out of the alley. Sylvain entered the market square with his usual confident swagger. The apprehension he had shown seconds lately locked tightly behind a facade of vapid gregariousness. He greeted the market vendors and passing shoppers with a charming grin and a playful word or two that, although Hubert could not hear what they specifically were, clearly dripped with a flirtatious charisma that seemed to come naturally to the paladin. A practiced ease that came from years of playing the role of a superficial philanderer, just another spoiled noble with too much money and time on his hands, prowling Baramis' busy streets for entertainment and overpriced trinkets. The long cloak still hung across his shoulders, concealed much of the paladin armor underneath. Thankfully, he had pulled back the hood, making him appear significantly less conspicuous. Sylvain's stalk of crimson curls stood out like a beacon, but fortunately, this far away from Fargus and Garreg Mach, the knight was less likely to be instantly recognized. Sylvain stood talking with a vegetable vendor, pointing animatedly at a bunch of cauliflower and broccoli. His back was to Myson, and the other mages standing less than a yard away. Hubert cringed as Sylvain turned sharply and, accidentally, collided with Myson, knocking the dark mage's hat askew and nearly toppling him over. Sylvain paused to fret over the fiend with feigned apologetic friendliness, while Myson's face fumed with murderous fury. He casually sauntered to the next vendor, this one selling bushels of oranges and lemons, and continued his charade. A wagon overloaded with wool garments imported from Elmira rumbled by the market, its heavy wheels crunching the gravel and stirring up a cloud of dust. Sylvain used the cover of the passing wagon to sneak back into the alley undetected. He approached Hubert at a brisk pace. Somehow, the paladin's face had grown even paler. Every trace of color leached into a ghostly pallor. Even the touches of sunburn seemed to have dulled into a grayish hue. He joined Hubert's side, ducking behind a stack of crates. He turned to the mage, his brows furrowed with distress. "I couldn't get much, but I heard them mention something about a Dominique crest-bearer. Are those bastards going after Annette?" Sylvain's eyes went wide, his face twisted in a mixture of indignation and panic. "I doubt it." Hubert frowned and narrowed his eyes at Myson. "There are plenty of crest-bearers stationed at Garreg Mach. Why target Annette, and the crest of Dominique specifically? Furthermore, Baramis is an odd place to congregate if they are planning to launch an attack on—" Hubert froze, and his breath tangled in his chest. Something he had learned about a certain member of House Eyre years ago, but had not given much thought to, sprung back to the forefront of Hubert's mind, and coated his blood with frost. "No. Hey, want to share with the rest of the class what's going on in that head of yours?" Sylvain asked sharply, his brows knitted together in a scowl. Hubert ducked close to Sylvain, his eyes near bulging with panic. "Ferdinand's mother, Lady Penelope, is originally from an exiled branch of House Dominique, and is a crest-bearer as well." Hubert felt ill, just voicing the words. The thought of the kind woman in the sanatorium, who had greeted Hubert with such warmth despite her deteriorating health, and Hubert's uninvited appearance, being subjected to the dark mage's vile experiments, sent rivers of molten fury coursing through his blood. Lady Penelope would not survive long under their torture in her current state. Furthermore, Ferdinand would likely be caught in the crossfire during any attempt to go after his mother. Ice crawled even deeper into Hubert's core, nearly shuddering his heart to a halt. If he failed at stopping Myson and the others, it was quite possible that those who slither in the dark would be leaving with 2 crest-bearers as prisoner. Sylvain's eyes went wide at Hubert's revelation as well, but panic quickly switched to rage. "Those sick bastards are going after Ferdinand's dying mother?" Sylvain shouted. "Well, what the hell are we standing around here for? We need to get over to the sanatorium and—" "Wait a minute, does that mean Annette and Ferdinand are cousins?" Hubert blinked and sputtered at Sylvain's sudden change in conversation. "Distant, but yes, Why am I just hearing about this now?" "I do not know all the details, but supposedly Lady Penelope's parents were involved in some rather unsavory dealings that led to their expulsion from the Dominique family." Hubert gritted his teeth and tried not to explode at the paladin's meandering questions. "Now, about how we should— Even so, I'm surprised. They must have really pissed off someone important to be disowned like that, especially with Fargus having its head so far up its own ass about the importance of crests. Although I agree it is a strange matter, it is not one of our concerns at this time. Now focus," Hubert snapped, interrupting Sylvain's next wave of questions. The paladin closed his already open mouth with a soft click. The mage took a deep breath and continued. "Now we know who their target is and where they are headed. We will need to proceed carefully, lest Myson and his others escalate the situation into a bloodbath. So, how do we do this? Do we head to the sanatorium and set up a defensive line?" Sylvain suggested. Hubert frowned and shook his head. "No, There are far too many ill and injured in the sanatorium. Turning the place into a battleground would be catastrophic, nor can we risk openly engaging them here in the market. We do not know the full scope of what they have planned. If they have creststones in their possession, they could turn citizens into demonic beasts and unleash them on the city. Or they may perhaps employ the same tactics they did in Vermeer, and work the citizens into a murderous frenzy. The most prudent course of action would be to draw them far away from the city in order to minimize casualties. Now, we just need something that will be an enticing enough lure to draw their attention. Sylvain's head shot up. His eyes went wide. You said they're after crest-bearers, right? A glowing smirk stretched across Sylvain's lips. Dread settled in Hubert's stomach like an anvil. Sylvain, what exactly are you intending to do? He cast a sideways glance to the companion, who had already stripped off his heavy cloak. Here, Sylvain tossed the cloak to Hubert. This should keep them from spotting you right away. Once they start following me, you try and pick them off from behind. If that doesn't work, haul ass to the sanatorium and get Ferdinand and his mother out in time. Before Hubert could respond, Sylvain tore the cloth away from the lance of ruin and sprinted into the market, coming to a halt only feet away from the cluster of dark mages. Red light pulsed from the relic's creststone, wrapping the twitching vertebrae along the lance's shaft in ominous scarlet rays. A bright grin lit Sylvain's face as a fire spell flickered to life in the palm of his hands. Sylvain lobbed 2 fireballs in quick succession. One took Myson's hat clean off his head. The second hit the dark mage square in the back and sent him sprawling face forwards onto the ground. Myson howled with rage as he was knocked down, spitting out chunks of dirt and dust. He rolled over and jumped back to his feet, sans hat, his face contorted with volcanic fury. His compatriots whirled in the direction the fireballs had come from, flickers of miasma and mire already simmering in their palms. Hey, chucklefucks, look at this! Nice shiny crest of Gautier here! Sylvain cheered, the crest of Gautier blazing to life in front of him. Come on, you swamp-dwelling son of a bitches! I'm right here! Come and get me! Hubert gaped at the paladin's display. That absolute lunatic! Despite the horror at Sylvain's ill-conceived plan to turn himself into bait, Hubert could not help the amused smirk curling the corners of his lips at the sight of Myson sputtering in the dirt. The veneer of civility melted away from the dark mages, like serpents shedding their skins. Sloths of dark magic coursed from the mages in a maelstrom of toxins. Spells of miasma, mire, and dark spikes coiled and swirled into formation as they gave chase to the night. Screams rose from vendors and customers alike as the marketplace quickly descended into chaos. Carts were overturned, horses whinnied in terror and galloped away without their riders. Produce and trinkets were knocked to the ground and stomped on in everyone's haste to flee. The grin on Sylvain's face grew wider as he sprinted away from the market square, launching 2 more fire spells over his shoulder at the advancing mages and jeering at his pursuers. Hubert wrapped the cloak around himself, pulling the hood over his face. He picked up the arrow of Indra, strapped it across his back, and ducked into the panicked crowd of Barama's citizens. Sylvain and the dark mages in pursuit were headed towards the city outskirts. Hubert cringed as a bolt of dark spikes lanced in Sylvain's direction with near-perfect accuracy. The knight barely had time to duck behind a nearby cart, the cascade of spikes impaling the aged wooden frame and sending a rain of splinters into the air. Once the spell dissipated, Sylvain sprinted from his hiding spot, summoning a Bolganone spell underneath the pursuers' feet and forcing them to disperse before continuing the deadly game of cat and mouse. Gradually, moving between the mingling crowds of fleeting citizens and slipping between the shadows, the first of the dark mages came in range. Dagger in hand, Hubert crept up to the first of the dark mages. He wrapped one arm tightly around the acolyte, muffling their panicked shouts with his gloved hand, while Hubert's other hand reached up to slit the dark mage's throat. With a choked gurgle and some weak thrashing, the dark mage eventually went still in Hubert's arms. He dragged the body to the side of the road and dumped it in one of the olive trees lining the streets. Everyone else was still preoccupied with either fleeing the city or scrambling for shelter. They paid no attention to Hubert, nor the dead body he had stashed out of sight. 8 more dark mages remained, including Meissen. The chase moved through the city and eventually led into the warehouse district. Sylvain had been forced to weave off course several times when a dark mage would warp in front of him, cutting off his escape route. On one occasion, a deluge of mire that had been summoned right on top of him was narrowly dodged as he rolled onto a side street, cursing as the acid sludge seeped down the road, melting everything it touched. Hubert trailed behind, still unseen, and shifting from shadow to shadow. 2 more dark mages were summarily disposed of, one with their throats slit like the first, the other sputtering with horror and confusion to find a well-placed dark spike impaled through their chest. When dragging the third body out of sight, Sylvain and pursuing dark mages had vanished from view. Hubert frowned, ears perked for telltale sounds of dark magic spells and the paladin's taunt. The clang of metal and the smell of sulphur drew his attention to a building 2 alleys over. Hubert crept to the location, peering behind stacks of crates and watching from the shadows. The commotion led him to a warehouse that, based on the smell, had been used to store fishing gear. 2 dead acolytes, killed by lance wounds based on their injuries, were strewn in a messy heap just feet away. Just outside the building, Sylvain had been pulled down to his knees. Spectral hands, woven from threads of shadows cast by banshee spell, held him in place, trying to wrench his limbs free from the ghostly shackles, but to no avail. Blood dripped from a large scrape that ran across his forehead. The lance of ruin lay just out of reach, the creststone still pulsing a hostile red. A pair of dark mages loomed over him, mire spells brewing in the air above them. "I say, we just kill him," spat one of the mages, while giving the struggling paladin a solid kick in the ribs. Sylvain grunted at the impact and curled in on himself, coughing. "This one possesses the crest of Gautier. Lord Thalis will find him to be of great use," sneered the other. Hubert gnashed his teeth, pulled the arrow of Indra from his back, and glided towards his target. The lance's blade plunged through the back of the first acolyte. When he wrenched the weapon free and turned to attack the other once, a blast of miasma from behind hit him in the back and sent him sprawling. Hubert sputtered and tried to push himself to his feet, only to be summarily kicked in the head. The blow sent him to the ground again, dazed. The world spun into dizzying sludge. He thought he heard Sylvain call out to him from the suffocating ringing that flooded his ears. Through the haze clouding his vision, Hubert could see 2 acolytes standing over him. One, the dark mage he had attempted to stab, and the other one who had somehow masked their presence and caught him unaware. He tried to push himself up. One of the acolytes stomped on his chest, knocking the wind out of his lungs and ripping a pained whimper from his throat. "This one doesn't have a crest. Should we just kill him?" asked the first acolyte. The second turned to Hubert with a dark grin and reached into his pocket. "Let's use the crest stone on this one. See what kind of creation this one will turn into." Hubert's eyes widened in terror as the acolyte held out a glowing crest stone and pointed it towards Hubert. The mage flailed, trying to shake off the acolyte, who was still pinning him to the ground. The cascade of uncanny red light from the stone crept near, descending like an executioner's axe. Suddenly, a flash of emerald green, immediately followed by a familiar battle cry, launched itself from the balcony above. An archangel, right out of fables, descending from the heavens and smiting his foes with righteous, incandescent fury. Both of the mages were knocked to the ground in a fury of copper and red. The creststone that had been aimed at Hubert rolled along the ground, out of reach, its ominous red dulled to a dormant grey. Roaring with a rage Hubert had rarely witnessed from the other man, Ferdinand whirled his lance and swung it at the attacking dark mages. The first slash caught an acolyte across the chest, causing the mage to stagger. Ferdinand followed up with a thrust through the acolyte's gut that sent the fiend to his knees, gurgling and slumping to the ground, where he perished moments later. The second mage tried to launch a miasma spell at the Holy Knight. Ferdinand effortlessly sidestepped the attack and charged at the acolyte as they scrambled to finish the incantation for their next spell. The crest of Keyhole blazed around Ferdinand again, and the lance's blade went clean through the mage, killing them instantly. Ferdinand wrenched his bloodied weapon away from the acolyte's corpse, panting heavily, and staring down at the body, with his face twisted in a mixture of hatred and disgust. Hubert's heart pounded in his chest, and heat blazed across his face as he took in the glorious sight of his rescuer. "Well, you certainly know how to make a dramatic entrance." Hubert chuckled between wheezed gasps of air. He clutched his bruised chest, feeling for any ribs that were broken or cracked. The fury on Ferdinand's face instantly melted into worry as he dashed to Hubert's side. "Hubert!" he cried out, dropping to his knees and cradling Hubert's upper body in his lap. Hubert would have savored the warmth of the position he was held in, had it not felt like his head and ribs had just had an avalanche of rocks dumped on them. He leaned his head against Ferdinand's solid chest and let his eyelid droop for a moment. Bright lights flickered to life in Ferdinand's palms as his hovering hands roamed up and down Hubert's battered body. The paladin's face was pursed with concentration. Faith magic was far from Ferdinand's greatest talent, usually being barely able to repair a hangnail, but the warming light helped ease some of the barbs of pain across his aching ribs and skull. Hubert did not think the dark mage had actually broken or even cracked anything, but bruising was likely possible. Either way, the healing glow cast from Ferdinand's palms helped him breathe just a bit easier. "I was so worried. I could not find you in the market and everything was chaos." Ferdinand's worry shifted to barely contained anger. "By the saints, if they had done something to you, Sheath your vengeance for now, Ferdinand. You will have ample opportunity to rain down your wrath on our foes in a moment." Hubert rasped with a small smile, placing a gloved hand over Ferdinand's glowing one. "Thanks to your timely intervention, I am largely unscathed." "I'm okay too, in case anyone cares," Sylvain's voice called out with a light chuckle. The Fargus paladin grunted and painstakingly pushed himself to his feet, leaning on a lance of ruin for support. "Heavens, Sylvain! My deepest apologies. Let me heal your injuries as well." Ferdinand gasped and helped Hubert to his feet. Sylvain chuckled and waved him off. "Just a few bumps and scrapes. Nothing a vulnerary or two won't patch up." He limped towards Hubert, with a grin many would colloquially describe as shit-eating. "Look whose gallant knight in shining armor showed up just in the nick of time to save your ass," Sylvain chuckled, with a playful elbow to Hubert's side. "If I'm not mistaken, I believe your own hindquarters were included in this rescue effort as well." Ferdinand watched the two of them, his face crumpled with distress. "Please forgive me for not arriving sooner. I heard the commotion and came here as soon as I could. I feared the worst when I heard the attacks originated from the market square and that you were nowhere to be found." Ferdinand's words came out in a flustered flurry, with barely a breath taken between them. "Hubert, just who are these people? Why have they decided to attack Baramas? They are no regular bandits, nor do they strike me as those the kingdom or church would associate with." "Your observation is most astute. They are, in fact, a separate organization entirely," Hubert answered with a grim nod. "Remember Crania and Solon from just before the war?" Sylvain cut in. "Basically, more of those assholes." "Flames? The skin shifters? Like the ones who impersonated Monica?" Ferdinand breathed, his amber eyes flickering with unease and darting between Hubert and Sylvain. Hubert sighed and approached his companion. He placed his hands on the holy knight's shoulders and looked him sternly in the eye. "Ferdinand, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You must return to the sanatorium at once and go to Lady Penelope's side. I have reason to believe that your mother's life may be in grave danger." "My mother?" Ferdinand cried, his face blanched and eyes pooled with unmasked horror. "But why? She has never wronged another person in her life. A gentler soul could not be found in all of Fodland. By the saints, why would someone target her?" "Some creepy bottom-feeding dark mages are after her blood," Sylvain cut in. Ferdinand's face somehow became even more ashen. His lips trembled, and tremors raced down his arms. He turned to the mage, with eyes swallowed in pools of terror. "Hubert, is this true?" "I would have worded the matter a little more tactfully," Hubert sent Sylvain a withering glare. "But, yes. In fact, I suspect that may be the primary reason they are here in Baramas to begin with. I believe we were able to eliminate most of them, but there are likely other agents hidden throughout the city. You mustn't linger here any longer. They could be headed towards the sanatorium as we speak. But what about the two of you? If their dark magic is as great as you say, you will need all the help you can get stopping these fiends, Ferdinand protested, his jaw clenched with stubborn determination. Ferdinand, Hubert said firmly, squeezing the paladin's shoulder and sending the man a sharp but plaintive look. Lady Penelope is defenseless and needs your protection. Sylvain and I will canvass the city for any stragglers that have managed to slip away. If those who slither in the dark are still lurking in Baramas, the citizens, as well as your mother, are in grave danger. Head to the sanatorium and do not leave Lady Penelope's side for any reason. Ferdinand opened and shut his mouth several times to protest, but eventually sighed and nodded his head with solemn resignation. Very well, I will make my way to the sanatorium at once. Both of you, please, be safe. Ferdinand cast one worried look at Hubert and Sylvain, before reluctantly turning and racing in the direction of the sanatorium. Hubert and Sylvain trailed behind as Ferdinand sprinted out of sight, checking the shadows and alleys for lurking dark mages. How many do you think there are? Sylvain asked as he searched behind an overturned cart. Hubert frowned, his own eyes narrowing and peering into a nearby alley. I counted 9 that were pursuing you. I was able to dispose of 4. It looked as if you eliminated 2, and Ferdinand killed 2 others. So, only 1 left? Sylvain said with a hopeful lilt. I doubt it, Hubert scoffed, as he poked his head inside an abandoned building. They would not risk sending all their agents to one location. Keep your guard up. As if on cue, 2 dark mages warped into the alley, one blocking the road ahead, the other materializing from behind and cutting off their escape route. The knight and mage stood back to back, their weapons drawn. Hubert quickly cast a banshee spell to anchor the first acolyte in place, followed up with a thrown dagger that caught the attacking dark mage in the throat. Sylvain charged at the acolyte blocking the road ahead, ducking under a cloud of miasma that had been aimed at him, and the crest of Gautier blazing as he slashed his blade up in a sweeping arc. The 2 mages eliminated, Hubert and Sylvain continued their way into the city. They were ambushed 2 more times. Both times, their attackers were summarily disposed of. Hey, how come you're not using your magic as often as usual? Sylvain asked, as he wiped the blood from the bone tendrils of his lance. Not that you aren't good with a dagger or a lance, but isn't casting your specialty? As much as I loathe to admit it, those who slither in the dark possess dark magic that far outclasses my own, and thus are highly resistant to magic of a similar nature. Seeing as my own repertoire of casting abilities is pulled from that very same branch of magic, most of my spells would likely bounce harmlessly off them like droplets of rain. Hubert seethed as he sheathed his dagger and retrieved his own lance. As they continued onwards, 2 more mages warped into an alley beside them. Before Hubert could react, Sylvain hurled the Lance of Ruin at the attackers. The relic radiated a swirl of pulsing, refractured light as it soared through the air before exploding on impact and instantly killing the 2 acolytes. Is that all of them? I could have sworn there were more. Sylvain frowned as he used his foot to nudge the dead dark mage over onto its back. Icy claws of unease latched at Hubert's chest as he mentally went over each of the dark mages they had killed. Sylvain, did you happen to eliminate Myson? No, I thought you got him. Sylvain's frown deepened. The claws in his chest clenched and tore, ripping the air from Hubert's lungs. The sanatorium! The words were breathed, each one cutting like shards of glass inside his throat. He turned to Sylvain sharply. Come, we must make haste. They sprinted down the streets of Baramas towards the medical facility. The muscles in Hubert's legs cramped and stung as he forced them to move faster, gasps of air drawn into his lungs like slicing blades. The sanatorium seemed impossibly far away. Sylvain ran alongside him, panting heavily, but otherwise having no trouble keeping pace with the mage, despite wearing full armor. At last, they reached the sanatorium grounds and burst inside the building. At first, everything seemed to be calm. Several of the priests and bishops in the lobby looked in their direction with confused faces as he and Sylvain rushed through the doors. A familiar shout and the clash of weapons and magic quickly drew their attention to the wing where Lady Penelope's room was located. Hubert and Sylvain sprinted in the direction of the noise. A handful of bishops and priests that were in the lobby quickly drew their tomes and began arming themselves for combat. "Protect the other patients! More attackers could be in the area!" Hubert barked over his shoulder at the bishops. They burst into the hallway to see Ferdinand and Myson locked in combat just outside Lady Penelope's room. Ferdinand lay crumpled against a wall, clutching his right shoulder and grimacing with pain. Thick clods of mire sludge clung to the armor piece and chewed through the sturdy iron. Wisps of pungent steam wafted from the pauldrons as the corrosive material ate its way through the metal to the flesh beneath. Ferdinand grit his teeth and dragged himself upright, his lance held shakily in one hand. Myson chuckled at the display. He kicked the lance out of Ferdinand's quaking hand, the sharp motion ripping a pained cry from Ferdinand. "Now, boy, if you would politely step aside, I may leave you with some of your flesh still clinging to your bones." Another mire spell bubbled in Myson's palm. Ferdinand grit his teeth and growled at the dark mage. Cold rage swarmed Hubert's veins like rivers of ice water. He gripped the arrow of Indra and launched himself at Myson. The dark mage whirled at Hubert and aimed the brewing mire spell above his head. Hubert was forced to duck to the side, narrowly evading the splash of acid that poured down on where he was standing seconds earlier. The burning liquid pooled and oozed across the floor in a caustic, burning puddle. Before Hubert could react, Sylvain leapt over the pool of mire and charged at Myson. Dark magic, thicker than any Hubert had encountered before, coiled in Myson's hands and took shape. Before he could warn the paladin, a starburst of crackling, black lightning struck Sylvain square in the chest. The knight convulsed on the spot. His whole body spasmed as the spell burned across his nerves. Jolts of lightning seared through his blood. His mouth was open in a soundless scream, face contorted with agony. "Sylvain!" Hubert and Ferdinand shouted, horrified, as he watched the Fargus knight collapse to the ground in a twitching heap. Sylvain did not answer. His limbs continued to spasm as the shock waves of the spell danced through his nerves. Clipped, ragged breaths, and the shaky rise of Sylvain's armored chest let Hubert know that the paladin was still alive. Ferdinand tried to push himself to his feet, only to be shoved to the ground by the acolyte. Myson stomped down on the holy knight's mire-burnt shoulder, causing him to howl in pain. Hubert snarled, gripped his lance, and dashed towards Myson. A dark spike materialized at Hubert's fingertips and was fired at the acolyte's head. As expected, Myson swept the spike away effortlessly, but it gave Hubert the opening he needed to throw his dagger. The blade missed its mark by several inches, plunging into Myson's shoulder instead of his chest like Hubert had intended. Myson roared and ripped the blade free. A banshee spell flickered to life seconds later. Spectral limbs latched onto Hubert's limbs and threw him against the stone wall. His vision and hearing swam again as he felt his skull connect with the hard wall. He grunted, trying to push himself upright with shaking hands, only for his arms to give out, sending him crashing to the floor. He gasped, squirming feebly like a fish trapped ashore. The arrow of Indra had rolled out of reach. He could vaguely hear Ferdinand calling out to him. Myson loomed over him like a reaper, a malevolent grin spreading across his vile face. A dark spike began to take shape in his palm. Suddenly, Myson froze. The spell in his hands flickered and died, the half-forged dark spike crumbling to dust. His eyes widened with shock. Cascades of light ripped from the dark mage by a Nosferatu spell were pulled from Myson's back and funneled towards a target behind him. A bright flash of orange flared as the crest of Dominique blazed to life. A moment later, Hubert's fallen lance was shoved through Myson's back, the sharp blade emerging from the dark mage's chest. The high-rank acolyte pawed at the blade that had impaled him, his face twisted with mangled horror and confusion. The lance was quickly ripped away. Myson sank to his knees, gurgling on his own blood, before sliding to the ground, dead. Standing behind Myson's dead body, gasping for air, and leaning heavily on the arrow of Indra for support, was Lady Penelope. Strands of sweat-slicked, faded ginger hair hung limply over her paled face. Her brittle arm shook as she struggled to cling to the lance. Every breath of air was ragged and sharp, but pride lit her face with a radiant glow. She smiled at Hubert before stumbling against the wall and slumping to the ground. "Mother!" Ferdinand called out as he painfully pushed himself to his feet. It took several tries for Ferdinand to maintain his balance, but eventually regained his footing and shambled towards his fallen mother. Hubert was having a similar struggle, clawing himself to a standing position. The world kept spinning in and out of focus. He leaned heavily on the wall and dragged himself toward the Holy Knight and his mother. "It has been some time since I have engaged in combat," Lady Penelope chuckled, with a weak smile as Ferdinand led her back to her bed. "I am happy to see I still retain some of my abilities. Mother, you will always be a valiant warrior, worthy of the greatest of legends." Ferdinand smiled warmly, despite his face being pinched with agony. "But please, you should not have risked yourself like that. I will not sit idly by as some horrid fiend harms my son and those he holds dear." Penelope fired back, with a surprising amount of fire. Hubert chuckled softly to himself upon hearing that very familiar stubborn fierceness being directed at Ferdinand himself. As Ferdinand assisted his mother with returning to her room, Hubert knelt by Sylvain's side. The paladin whimpered and shuffled as consciousness returned to him. "Ow, fuck. Did we win?" Sylvain groaned, cracking an eye open. "Barely, but yes," Hubert chuckled. "How are you feeling?" "Like every nerve just got lit on fire," Sylvain mumbled with a pained grimace. "What the hell did I get hit with?" "Bore X," Hubert explained. "A rare and excruciatingly painful spell. It will not kill the target who is hit with it, but it will sear them with enough pain to make most subjected to it beg for death." "Terrific." "Immediate treatment is essential to avoid permanent nerve damage. I suppose it is most fortuitous that we are already in a sanatorium brimming with healers. Let us find a bishop who can take a closer look at your wounds," Hubert said with a wry smirk. "I imagine we all need to be patched up after that fiasco." The next few hours slipped by with comparative tranquility. A priest examined Hubert for concussions and cracked ribs. After a few healing spells and a swig of foul-tasting medicine, he was cleared to leave. Ferdinand met him in the hallway with a warm smile. A heavy bandage drenched in the acrid scent of healing poultice covered his right shoulder, but the Holy Knight seemed no worse for wear from the mire burns. He approached Hubert and wrapped the mage in a warm embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hitching with barely contained tears. Hubert returned the hug and leaned into the other man, pressing his face against Ferdinand's shoulder. Beneath the pungent scent of poultice and traces of sulphur, Ferdinand's usual scent of twigs and berries filled Hubert's senses and wrapped his tattered nerves in soothing warmth. Sylvain joined them in the hall minutes later, groaning heavily, but otherwise fully recovered from taking a direct hit from a Bore X spell. "We cannot delay any further," Hubert said grimly, as he looked between the two men. "We need to move Lady Penelope to safety immediately. I have sent word to any Vestra agents in the area, but it may take time for them to arrive." "Hey, you've got two trusted allies right here with you," Sylvain pointed out, gesturing to himself and Ferdinand. "Let us help you out. The three of us will have no problem getting Ferdinand's mother to safety." "I think that is a splendid idea," Ferdinand cut in before Hubert could protest. "We have fought by your side countless times. Who else could you better trust in such a delicate task? Besides, after everything that has transpired today, I would feel far more comfortable personally escorting my mother to Lady Eileen's home." Hubert looked between the eager faces of the two paladins. An objection to the request bubbled in his throat. The two men had been dragged into enough mess for one day. Then again, as Ferdinand said, there were few others that Hubert held with such trust. "Very well," Hubert sighed, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Allow me to make the preparations. We should be ready to set out shortly."